Aaron Anguiano, Leah Ashford, Josh Bridegroom,
He's probably not here.
Wendy Bird, Trish Christensen,
Here.
Darius Crosby, Birgit Flatiger, Teresa Gamboa, Adriana Garcia or Johnny Garcia, Jonathan Grammatico,
He's online. So Jonathan, can you hear us?
Jonathan Grammatico,
He's online.
Austin Grant, Brad Hahn, Thomas Helm,
He's online.
Ruben Imperial,
Not here.
Jennifer Jennison,
Online.
Will Kelly, Marian Martino, Matthew Mason, Linda Mayo, Perfecto Munoz, Maria Perez, Nico Solorio, Dan Starr, Aaron Tate,
Online.
Tim Zierli. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know we have a few folks joining us on Zoom. I wasn't able to hear them. I just want to make sure they able to speak when they need to.
We have Jonathan, Thomas, Jennifer, and Aaron online.
Wonderful. I just want to make sure we're able to hear them. And I see. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Perfect. All right. Sounds good. As hope we all know, we're working our way through our educational program as I usually out in the beginning of this process. So we're entering the third topic, which is accountability. And unlike the previous two sections, we've split this. This is a two-parter. So we're going to have two meetings. One this evening, we're going to hear from the department about accountability measures that are currently in place. And we're going to have a meeting second meeting in January, where we'll hear about other ideas we might want to consider in making recommendations. Just a couple housekeeping things. You'll see over there are some flip charts with the membership on the ad hoc groups. So I just want to ask everyone who's here in person and here virtually to review that and make sure that that's up to date. I think some of you will remember back in September, October, a bunch of us put sticky notes on a board. And you may not have thought much about it since then, but I just encourage everyone to go back and look at what your assignments are and think about what your capacity is to contribute. And I just say that because all three committees are full, and I know we have at least one person who's trying to get on one of the ad hoc groups. So especially if you're on multiple committees, especially if you think you might be a little overextended, consider going down to one committee or just whatever makes sense for you. Hopefully by the end of the night we'll have room for everyone. If you're happy with your assignments, maybe just put a check mark next to your name just so we know you reviewed it. And folks who are with us virtually, feel free to reach out to me or reach out to staff or do whatever you can so we can make sure we review your ad hoc group assignments with you. All right, and kind of on that topic, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the ad hoc groups in a bit, but just want to encourage folks to think about, as you look at what you have capacity for, think about if you might have capacity to step into a leadership role. We're going to need leadership on each one of these ad hoc groups to help us coordinate and facilitate meetings and collect and gather ideas and help us do the final work of creating our recommendations. So think about if that's something you might be able to do. If you have questions, if you think you might be interested but don't know what that means or how much time it's going to take or if you'd be a good fit, I'd be more than happy to talk. I'm sure Kate and Michael would also, to kind of talk you through what that looks like and give you whatever support you need. All right, and then we had some discussion previously about transparency at the ad hoc group, so we're going to get into that momentarily in just a few minutes. And then we'll talk about this more at the end of the meeting, but the last thing I kind of wanted to highlight is thinking about where we go from here. So we're in our kind of series of educational meetings that's going to take us through January. After February, that's the beginning of where it all kind of comes back to us, and it's on us to start thinking about what other information or questions we have and to ultimately start making recommendations. Another piece of that is what other voices we need to hear. I was thinking back to our very first meeting when Michael was talking about who we bring into the room, right? And so one idea that had been floated is additional listening sessions, right? And so we all have constituencies or people we work with, and so just think about if there are voices that you're in communication with that you think we need to consult in a piece of our work, right? That's something we're going to be looking at January, February, and it's never too soon to start planning. Those things can take a while to put together. So I just want to kind of put that invitation out to everyone, and probably be discussed more in the ad hoc meetings. All right, so those are kind of general announcements and welcome. And then, as I said, our intention here is we're going to talk a little bit about the ad hoc groups, and then we're going to have our education presentation on accountability from the department, and then talk a little bit more about next steps. Here's kind of a rough schedule, and we're 5 minutes ahead of schedule, which is great. Just a reminder, these are our group agreements that we talked about the first time. This is a living document, something we can update as needed, but just want to put this up to remind ourselves about how we've all agreed to work together. Okay, and so with that, getting into the ad hoc group. So the first thing we're doing is accepting minutes from the November 10th Policies and Procedures ad hoc meeting. So we've had exactly one ad hoc meeting so far, and in your packet, and if it's not already, will soon be online on the website, are the minutes from that meeting. So this is something for us to accept and look at and help make sure that we're all informed about what was going on in that meeting. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out or reach out to members of that ad hoc group. The second thing is ad hoc group updates. So this is going to be a regular part. Every meeting we're going to have updates from the ad hoc groups. The update this time is that both ad hoc groups are meeting tomorrow. So we attempted to try and schedule them before today. It just didn't. We missed it by one day. So both the Policies and Procedures ad hoc group and the Alternative Response ad hoc group are meeting tomorrow. So we'll have substantive updates in our January meeting. All right, and then the last thing is a discussion about transparency. So this is something we heard from a few members of the work group as well as members of the public. Kind of requests or thoughts that we should go beyond our minimum legal responsibility in providing additional transparency on these ad hoc meetings. So last meeting I asked anyone who's interested in this or has thoughts on this to reach out to me, and several of you did, and I had a number of discussions with members of the work group and a few members of the public who were very interested in this. And I think where the consensus that I kind of felt from those conversations is to do what we just did, is have written minutes from each ad hoc meeting and have those available to the full work group and available to the public. I think that balances a lot of things. First of all, I said this last time, you can't overstate the complexity. It sounds like a very simple thing, but the complexity of doing more, of having these being publicly noticed and having public comment and having live stream and things like that. And I think this gives us a space to talk that's a little bit more informal with transparency through these meeting minutes. And most importantly, and I can't emphasize this enough, all of the real decision making about our recommendations happens in these full work group meetings. So that was what I kind of got from the conversations that I've had with work group members who have reached out. So what we're going to do is, if anyone has an immediate, urgent, clarifying question or something you just have to say right now, you're welcome to. Then we're going to take public comment on this, right? So we'll hear from the public. And then we're going to consider taking action on this. Basically a vote to, we'll consider voting to implement this procedure of having public minutes on each ad hoc group meeting. So first, just want to pause and see, does everyone in the work group understand that? Does that make sense? Good. All right. Excellent. So we will discuss this momentarily, but right now we'll turn it over to public comment before we take action on this. Staff, do we have any public comment? Nope, no public comment? Oh, we do? Okay. I think we're just working on unmuting. Oh, okay. All right. And I just want to confirm, are our work group members who are with us on Zoom, are they now able to speak? Yeah. Great. All right. Any comments or discussion on this? And I want to give this the attention it deserves, but also want to quickly move on to our educational presentation. So I just open up if anyone has any thoughts they'd like to share before we take action.
I'm just wondering who will be taking minutes? Will it be a volunteer from the group or a county staff member?
Yes, that is an excellent question. Yeah, it will be a member of the work group, so that's an added responsibility. I think we want someone to step up and take on that role. Kate was nice enough to take these first minutes that we had, but yeah, that's a responsibility we're going to have to take on. Thank you for asking.
Okay.
Absolutely. All right. So if there's no other comments, I'll make a motion that we, as policy, have publicly available meeting minutes. Oh, I'm sorry, Kate. Oh yes, Scotty.
You have a hand up, Tom Hill.
Oh yes, Tom, please.
And then Trissa can allow to speak.
Yeah, sorry. I saw. Oh, I can hear myself. Oh, that's better. I saw that Tom Crane, who's actually the chair of the ACLU Stanislaus, was the public comment. So I just didn't know if maybe he couldn't get connected. I just wanted to make sure we didn't just move past that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Does Tom Crane wish to
Hello?
speak? Hello?
Hello?
Hi.
Yes, this is Tom Crane.
Hey, Tom, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, my name's Tom Crane, and I am the chapter chair of the ACLU of Northern California Stanislaus County chapter. I'm getting weird stuff on my screen. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine, Tom. Go right ahead.
Oh, excellent.
Yes.
I wanted to comment on the importance of transparency. As important as first principles are, to chip away at them to minimize or marginalize transparency by not making everything fully public, to minimize it with just simply minutes rather than zooming and seeing what people have to say and seeing their expressions and what they think. I think it's terribly important that you have full transparency for this committee. Any work that this group does, any subcommittee that this group has that does work, should be fully public. And I can't emphasize how important that is. It doesn't matter how few or how many people are present to listen. If it's YouTube, if it's Zoomed, people can look at it at their convenience. And it's important that the public knows what you people are doing and how you're doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Tom Helm, for making sure we didn't miss public comment. All right, unless there are any other comments at this time, I want to make a motion that, as a policy, we keep minutes of our ad hoc group meetings and that we accept those meetings at each work group meeting and make sure that those minutes are publicly available. And I see, yep. Everyone's microphones are turned off, so just hit the switch to speak.
There we go. All right. As Mr. Crane just said, I do think that just the minutes is
not the same level of transparency that we say give to these meetings. These meetings, as Mr. Crane said, are available for Zoom. We don't necessarily have to have public comment during subcommittee meetings, but I would say like full video transcripts of the meeting should be made to the public.
Thank you. So as a motion, I guess I'll ask, do we have a second? Second. All right. Thank you. So heard from Matthew. Any other comments or discussion? Okay. If not, let's go ahead and take a vote. And should we do a roll call vote? Is that appropriate? Yeah.
Sorry, and the vote is to have official minutes of the subcommittee meetings, correct?
That's right. Publicly available minutes, yeah. That's right.
And I'll just say quickly that, I'm obviously, because I mentioned it before, I'm in agreement with Mr. Crane, and, hopefully that we will try to be as transparent as possible moving forward. I'll just say that.
Thank you. Yes. I hear beeping. Does anyone know what that is? Oh, it's gone. Okay. Got it. Okay. Unless there's any other comments, maybe we'll proceed to the roll call.
Okay, Solange Altman. Aye. Aaron Anguiano.
Aye.
Leah Ashford.
Aye.
Trish Christensen.
Aye.
Teresa Gamboa. Aye. Johnny Garcia.
Aye.
Jonathan Grammatico.
Aye.
Brad Hahn.
Aye.
Thomas Helm.
Aye.
Jennifer Jennison.
Aye.
Will Kelly.
Aye.
Marian Martino. Aye. Matthew Mason.
Aye.
Linda Mayo. Maria Perez. Nico Solorio. Dan Starr. Aaron Tate.
Aye.
Tim Zierli.
Aye.
All right. Motion passes unanimously. And I just want to say I think we did the best we could to balance a whole bunch of different complicated things and keep ourselves focused on the work at hand and not get too tangled up in these details. So I look forward to moving forward on this. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to staff for our educational presentation for the evening.
Mike, your mic isn't working.
No, Mike isn't. So Mike and I just want to, really acknowledge the information that we've already taken in when it comes to policies and procedures and alternative responses. Tonight is about accountability. And so it's important for us to know that this is a two-part session on accountability. And this is just to kick off the learning on that accountability. And if we run into any areas, questions will be acceptable tonight. So if you have questions, we want you to ask those questions. But if we run into areas where we get into the weeds, then we're going to put those questions into the parking lot, right? So that we can continue to move forward. We have our presenters, who is Ivan Valencia and Chris Adams. And let's just appreciate them for coming and spending this time to give us this learning about
Mike?
Good evening, everybody. As Mike said, my name is Ivan Valencia. I'm the Assistant Chief of the Modesto Police Department. This is my partner, Lieutenant Chris Adams. I'll let him introduce himself and what he does for the police department.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Adams. I'm a lieutenant with the police department. I've been there about 15 years full-time. I currently work in our support division, which oversees hiring, training, recruitment, and things of that nature. Little history about tonight when we talk about accountability. In my history, is I worked for just over 2 years in the Internal Affairs Unit, which gives you a lot of information that talks about the topics we're going to talk about tonight. And then also hiring and accountability falls in my division that I work in currently.
And we did leave at the end of the presentation, there's a slide open for questions. So if you do have a question and if it can wait, we prefer that it be asked at the end. That way we keep our presentation on track and respect everybody's time as well. So accountability, I apologize if some of these slides are elementary, but sometimes people have questions as to how the Modesto Police Department works, and I may know it, Chris may know it, but the general public typically sometimes doesn't. So with our presentation, we want to first describe the city structure and the organization, the hiring process, the internal affairs process, the personal complaints, our use of force and pursuit reviews, officer-involved shootings, critical incidences, audits, police personnel records, and legislative updates. So this is just a quick organizational chart as to how the police department falls in line with the rest of the city. The police department is one of many departments that is overseen by the city manager's office. The city manager is appointed by the city council, and the city council is voted in by the citizens of Modesto. So that's our first kind of workflow as far as accountability. It's citizens of Modesto, city council, city manager, and then he oversees the rest of the city departments, which the police department is one of those. And the city manager appoints the chief of police. Yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt. I think you're coming across a little muffled with the mask, and I think you're 6 feet away from anyone. So my understanding is if you want to remove the mask, okay.
That'd be awesome.
Thank you.
And staff can confirm that's acceptable?
Yeah, most everybody else is back. So if you all can.
Right. Right. So work group members, as soon as we're finished eating, we'll put our mask on. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, and that helps me personally because it's tough to talk up here with that thing on, so thank you. So as we go into accountability, and we talked about the roadmap, obviously you're going to see a lot of internal procedures that we have to hold ourselves accountable as police. And that occurs in the sworn and the non-sworn ranks within the department. But it starts before people enter our organization is how we hold ourselves accountable. So we start with the hiring process. This gives you the long list of what it takes to be hired simply as a police officer with our agency. I'm not going to go into every single bullet point up here to talk about the hiring process because it can be lengthy. I could talk about it for hours. But what I want to show and illustrate in this is that there are several levels of accountability as we start to bring people into the organization. While this is sworn, everybody that comes into our organization has a background check done on them, an extensive background check. That starts with the personal history statement, which is created by POST, the Police Officers Standards and Training, which I know you've heard of already. But they create an extensive 30-page questionnaire about everything that you've ever done in your entire life, good, bad, or indifferent. And we start right up front bringing that in so we can start examining it. The first thing we do with that within our organization is we look over that, both at a lieutenant and a captain level typically, and we make a determination based off of that about moving into a polygraph examination. A polygraph examination goes over all of the questions within that. So it's a next layer of accountability and making sure that we're bringing people in that are telling the truth, one of the most important things when it comes to law enforcement. Everything else within this, we talk about an oral interview, obviously getting to know that person, the polygraph examination, but after the polygraph, so we've already had these 2 layers of learning about that individual, an extensive background investigation is done by a trained background investigator, someone that actually does a detective type investigation into that person's personal life, everything that they want to know. And we talk to everybody that they tell us about, and we talk to people that they don't tell us about. We talk to exes, we talk to people that don't like them, because we want to learn truly what this person is like before we bring them into the organization to know what could come up in some inquiry 5, 10, 15 years down the road if somebody out in the world does an investigation on themselves. We have to make sure that they have a background that is suitable to be in the police world. As we go through that, if you make it through the background investigation, you meet the chiefs that you see here tonight, which is another layer of getting to know that person, plus a medical and then a psychological screening, which again, getting to know that person and everything about them. This process here typically takes about 3 months, and that's if you're really pushing forward in that investigation, but it gives you an idea of, before we let someone come in the door, we're looking to see what type of person they are and make sure that they can come and work in the field of law enforcement. Again, this is not just sworn officers. This is also non-sworn full-time employees or part-time employees with some modifications to this, but everybody has a background done on them before they enter the doors.
Sorry, question?
Yes.
Question about, I know in some departments it's policy that applicants sign a waiver so the personnel records, if they've worked as a police officer before, can be viewed. Is that policy in Modesto?
You're saying to sign that personnel records would be made public?
No, not public, but available to the hiring agent.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So they sign waivers at the initial application process before we send them to polygraph and background that says that we're going to look into your personal history, yes. Has to be notarized before it can be turned in.
Personal history, personnel records if they've worked at a police officer in another department.
Correct, and you're talking about past agencies.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, thank you. So if we have someone coming from another agency, yes, they have to sign a waiver that says we can look into all the records that agency has, plus any agencies they've applied for. So we can talk to agencies that they are applied and weren't even successful at to ask for the information on maybe why they were not successful at that agency and being picked up. So yes, thank you. So this just gives you a quick snapshot of two things. One, a large decrease in hiring for law enforcement in general, but this is Modesto Police Department statistics over how many applicants and how many people we've hired. What this goes to show is the number of people that actually apply for the position to the number of people that we actually hire. And I'll get out of the way of some of the numbers here, but right around 3% or less is what's being hired through the screening process as they come in. So what I want to illustrate when we talk about this is truly are looking for people that can hold this position and be held accountable. Backgrounds is oftentimes where people can get I would, for lack of a better term, washed out of the process because they carry some baggage that maybe could make this job difficult for them, make it difficult to testify, things of that nature. But it shows that we are scrutinizing very heavily. Also shows a very large decline in applicants in general, and this is nationwide right now, as we can see across law enforcement. So transitioning out of the hiring process and talking about internal accountability with all of our levels, we have an internal affairs unit at the Modesto Police Department. It's currently overseen by the Chief of Police. They report directly to the Chief of Police. There's a lieutenant that oversees the unit, 2 sergeants, a detective, and a civilian clerk that works in there. Those positions specifically have changed over the years. It used to be a sergeant that would oversee that unit, reporting directly to the chief. In the last 5 to 8 years or so, we changed that to where a lieutenant oversees that position, and it's actually sergeants that are doing the majority of internal affairs investigations, with one detective assigned who has some dual duties but is also working in the internal affairs unit. So that model has changed a bit to where there's a higher level of supervision, a higher level of investigator by having sergeants in there as actual investigators that report to the lieutenant, that report to the chief. So that's kind of the makeout of what the internal affairs unit looks like. So this is obviously a pretty busy slide, but this is giving you an idea of when a person wants to make a complaint against any individual within the organization. I preluded this to internal affairs because investigations do eventually make it to that office, but depending on the type of investigation, it could go a different direction. And I'll talk about that so you have an understanding. But anybody out in the community can make a complaint against a member of our department, sworn or non-sworn, it does not matter. And they can come in various forms or fashion, writing, an email, they could fax it in person, call on the phone to talk to us, on a call for service, wherever that may be. Pretty much any mode of communication you could think of, a complaint can come through. From there, a department member is required to accept a complaint. It is the law to accept complaints. We have to take those in some form or fashion. I'll talk about in a little bit what different types of complaints there are, but if someone calls and they are upset about some type of service, we can't just hang up and ignore that. That's not how that works. We have to accept that complaint. So typically a department member will notify a supervisor if it comes directly to a line level person of that complaint, and the supervisor the one handled it accordingly, meaning that the supervisor will take that alleged misconduct in and farm it to either internal affairs or a line level supervisor, which I'll talk about. Or if they actually observe the conduct themselves, they can also generate what is an internal affairs or internal complaint. We do extend anonymous or third-party complaints if there's sufficient information to corroborate the information. Obviously, there has to be something that relates to it that we can find, either that call for service or that particular employee was around when that alleged incident occurred, something similar to that, but we do accept third-party complaints or anonymous complaints. And then, of course, if we have lawsuits or things that come up through the back end through criminal investigations or through civil lawsuits, we can also open or complete internal affairs investigations or handle complaints if they come in from that direction. So this just gives you a snapshot of how we can actually receive complaints, which pretty much from anywhere is where they can come in. So there's two different types of classifications of complaints, formal and informal. And I'll kind of explain how those work. Formal complaints, I can give you an example, is somebody called in and said that this department member has committed a crime. They know that they're cheating on their taxes, or they had excessive force on this particular person. That is considered a formal complaint that will go to a supervisor and determine whether it's going to be internal affairs or handled at the line level. But it will be documented as a formal complaint with the Internal Affairs Office, creating an internal affairs case number. That falls into our tracking, our auditing, everything that we report to the Department of Justice about the number of complaints we received. That is a formal complaint for this list of items: commission of a crime, excessive force, drug use, dishonesty, sexual harassment, discrimination, any act of a serious nature. So that is considered formal. There are things that are considered informal, and I'll talk about that and kind of compare them. If I'm working as the watch commander, overseeing a patrol division, if someone calls in and said, "This officer just left my house and he didn't arrest my neighbor like I told him to," that is something that happens all the time. Now, that's not necessarily considered a formal complaint. That's someone upset about a type of service, maybe a misunderstanding of policy or procedure that can be handled at the supervisor level, that wouldn't get routed to internal affairs for a complaint, unless we delved into it and there was something much more serious to it, that it was favoritism or discrimination or whatever that may be. But it may be just explaining, well, they couldn't arrest them because no one was present to see it, or no one was willing to sign a citizen's arrest. That's just a misunderstanding of the law, as opposed to just being upset about something that occurred, as opposed to having some nefarious thing that actually occurred during that incident. Perceived discourteousness or rudeness. If someone's upset about the way that they were talked to, it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a formal complaint. That typically could be handled at the line level. Oftentimes, though, that matters on what the citizen would like to see done. The person that's calling in, if I talk to them and say, okay, it sounds like you're upset because you didn't like the way the officer talked to you. You didn't like the way this clerk talked to you on the phone. Is that accurate? Yes. Okay, I can talk to them about this. I can make sure that that never doesn't happen again. Are you okay with that? If they tell us yes, then that is considered an informal complaint that could be handled at the supervisor level. If they tell us no, absolutely not, I want this to go to internal affairs, I want the chief to know about this, I want a full investigation, I want to put pen to paper, I want to make a formal complaint because I didn't like the way they talked to me, that would generate a formal complaint and be routed to internal affairs. It doesn't mean that the investigators in internal affairs necessarily are going to do the case themselves. That may go back to a sergeant to handle, but it will receive an internal affairs case number. It's going to be reported to DOJ at the end of the year. It's all part of that process when it comes to formal investigation. So that's the difference between the two. Oftentimes it's what the citizen would like to see done in that instance. Oftentimes it's just a matter of being heard. So if they can be heard, a citizen calls in, can be heard, we can talk about the policy or procedure, these low-level things. If someone calls in and says that this officer completely lied about this incident, it's true, I'm not going to just say we're going to work this out. That's going to go to internal affairs, right? But something like this, these low-level things, minor misconduct, minor infractions, an officer speeding down the roadway and you didn't like seeing that, and we talk about it and it can be handled at an informal level, that would be considered an informal complaint. Okay. So let's transition to talking about formal complaints and where they go. Because as I could tell you that if we handle informal things over the phone or in person, or we have a counseling session with an officer, all those things happen daily when you think about how a business in general runs. You have people that come in and are upset about a type of service or whatever it may be, but it could be low-level violations. Let's talk about what happens when we do have misconduct or potential misconduct and it turns into a formal investigation. As you see all these things here, we have requirements that Internal Affairs has to investigate. I mentioned the rudeness complaint that someone that says adamantly, I want this to be a formal investigation. We can assign an IA case number to that. We can have internal affairs at least start the investigation, but that investigation likely will go back to a field lieutenant or a field sergeant to handle the actual investigation. Interviews with the officer if needed, review of personal body-worn cameras if needed. Could be handled by a supervisor. Some investigations, though, our department policy, and this is where this comes from, requires that internal affairs is going to look into it because of the seriousness of it. And those different things are crimes committed by a department member, excessive force, use of illegal drugs, dishonesty, sexual harassment, discrimination. Any cases the chief of police has decided, I want IA to look at this as opposed to a line level supervisor. And then anything that comes over from division commanders that they say, I want IA to look at this. An example, it could be somebody that maybe excessive amounts of collisions could be investigated by internal affairs. That's an internally generated complaint and could come over and the division captain or the chief says, I want IA to look into that incident. So these are things that IA has to look at. Per our department policy, we would set this in place and says, internal affairs is going to look at these types of cases specifically. We don't want line level sergeants, we don't want line level lieutenants looking into these types of cases. Supervisors, though, conversely, if we have allegations of lower level things, but it is a formal complaint, we can have them, our sergeants, our lieutenants, look into these types of things. As we mentioned already, minor department violations, a complaint of somebody speeding down the road, rudeness, things like that are not excessive, that it's not a constant complaint about the same person, can be handled at that line level supervisor. So that personnel complaint comes in, someone calls in and says, I observed this officer commit excessive force and I have a video of it. The supervisor that's working that day is going to accept that complaint because we have to, and the policy and law dictates that we will. We're going to accept that complaint. Supervisor's going to forward that to his immediate lieutenant for review. This is outside the investigation. This is leading into an investigation, but it starts getting layers of review. They send it to their lieutenant for review. The captain then reviews it after the lieutenant. And then internal affairs gets the investigation. So the initial supervisor, lieutenant, and captain have all seen it. They all are aware of this complaint, and now it's sent over to internal affairs for investigation. Once it's there, IA conducts a thorough investigation. With that, the investigators that I mentioned before, the sergeants, are the ones that are tasked with that. They will do everything under the sun to try to bring all the evidence to light regarding this particular incident. That's interviewing witnesses, looking at body-worn camera footage, listening to 911 tapes, getting witnesses out in the field, citizen witnesses, any cameras that may have captured it that are not body-worn camera footage, and then typically interviewing the accused officer involved in that type of misconduct. That entire investigation is put together and it's supervised by the IA lieutenant. They're up to speed the entire time about what's happening. That investigation is packaged up and it's sent back to the original captain that sent the complaint over to internal affairs. That captain then decides what lieutenant is going to do what's called an initial disposition or recommendation. They're going to read over the entire investigation. They're going to compare the investigation to the internal policies and procedures as well as law to determine if there were any violations of policy. They make an initial assessment and recommendation, say, yes, I do think there were policy violations here, comparing our evidence to our policies, or no, I don't. And they send that recommendation to the captain. The captain then reads the entire investigation, looks at that recommendation, decides if he agrees or disagrees that there was a violation of policy or there wasn't, if there's associated discipline with that, if there is a violation, and then that is forwarded back to the executive staff, which contains the chief, assistant chief, and all the captains. And then they look at that investigation. They get a presentation from internal affairs, as well as the captain that actually reviewed the case, and they make a final determination on whether it was in policy, out of policy, and if there's discipline behind it, which takes a whole nother route. So a lot of layers of review go into this. A lot of people typing out summaries and having a good understanding of what the case is all about and all the evidence that's involved in it. But it's seen by many people at many levels as it works its way through the process. So, as I mentioned, executive staff, which includes the chiefs and the captains, have reviewed a case, and let's say that they found the case sustained, that they found that there was enough evidence, which it's 51%. Basically, if they believe that there's 51% that this likely could have occurred, then they would sustain the allegations, meaning there's a policy violation committed by this person. Or you would have a not sustained, unfounded, or exonerated. That would mean, and I'll go into those definitions. Sustained means, though, yes, we do believe this occurred. Not sustained, unfounded, exonerated, I'll cover here. Unfounded, when there's a disposition and internal affairs investigation of unfounded, it means the acts did not occur or that they didn't involve any department members. That's different than if you go down to exonerated. Exonerated means it did occur, but it was within policy and procedure. The example I'll talk about driving. So if someone made a complaint about someone's excessive speed in their driving when they had their lights and sirens on, someone may be upset about that. Let's say it went all the way to formal complaint. If someone was exonerated in a case like that someone accused and said they shouldn't have been doing that, that would mean that, no, they were actually driving to an officer who had been shot. They were within policy and procedure to drive lights and sirens in that manner, as long as they stopped for all the lights and things of that nature. Unfounded would mean that officer did not do that. He wasn't there when that occurred. That accusation came upon him, and it actually didn't happen at all. It doesn't exist. So that's the difference between the two. Exonerated means, yes, it did happen, but it's within policy and procedure. Unfounded means that it didn't happen whatsoever. Not sustained means that we can't prove if the act occurred or did not occur. There's not enough evidence to say, to get us over that 50%, to get us that 51% to say that it did occur. So a not sustained is, we don't know if it happened, but we can't prove that it happened. There's not enough evidence in this case to say that it did or it didn't. And then, of course, sustained means that it did happen. Closed, which is not up here, but if someone leaves the agency prior to an investigation being completed, it would simply be closed because they're not an employee of us anymore, so the investigation is concluded. We can't have a finding after someone doesn't physically work there anymore. If we got a late complaint for someone that's retired or whatever that may be, we wouldn't open an investigation, it would simply be closed. So, a little bit confusing to look at this chart, but this gives you an idea of the directions that it can occur if there are sustained allegations. So, I give an example of, let's say there was a sustained allegation of someone crashed too many times, or we got that complaint of very aggressive driving and they crashed into somebody. We have sustained allegations of policy violations. The recommendation that comes out of executive staff, discipline imposed on someone, that employee has the right to fight that discipline, if they so choose, through a variety of measures. They can accept that discipline if they are told you're going to get a day off or whatever that may be. They can absolutely accept that and say, I have no argument about the discipline, I'm going to accept it. If they receive a written reprimand, which is the lowest level of actual discipline per definition, that can't go to a Skelly hearing, which I'll talk about in a minute, or an appeal. The only appeal you have is directly to the city manager. So that's the only discipline that could be imposed that doesn't have a right to actually be argued, to go to Skelly, to go to arbitration, all that. You could simply only go to the city manager, lowest level of discipline. But recommended, say, a day off, a person can accept that and the discipline would occur. They could also, if they choose to, go to what's called a Skelly hearing. Skelly hearing is an opportunity for them to come in and talk about that particular case and argue why they think the discipline should be lower. And you'll kind of see this tree here, but I'm going to talk about Skelly slides. But if a Skelly hearing, if the person who hears the Skelly hearing, which is an independent person who didn't vote on the original discipline within the organization, if they decide to uphold that discipline, they can, or they can choose to modify it, whether it's lessen it, eliminate it, whatever that may be. But that's how it goes down this process here. Then the discipline occurs. If the employee still does not agree with that discipline, which most of you who work in business familiar with independent arbitrators, they can take that to an independent arbitrator, and then that independent person would decide if that discipline fits what violations occurred. But that would happen after all discipline has been given out, has actually been completed, but they could go to arbitration. An independent person can make that decision. So this is, if you're not familiar with Skelly hearings, this is the actual hearing that happens with an internal person who did not vote originally on the discipline to be imposed on someone. Basically, they have to be provided all the information with the case, the entire internal affairs file, all the witnesses, all the recordings, everything that goes into it, and they have an opportunity to come forward and present their case to ask for discipline to be reduced in that case. That Skelly hearing officer can uphold that discipline, or they can modify it based off of what they feel is fair given those particular circumstances. The Skelly hearing is not to change the facts of the case. It's not to present further evidence. It's simply to do with the discipline of the case and try to reduce that if the employee chooses to do so. So, as I kind of wrap up on at least the complaint process and where discipline can come from through our internal processes, these are the reasons people could be disciplined within our organization and within most law enforcement organizations. Laws, rules, and order pretty much cover every single policy that we have. I know there's been discussions within this group about policies and procedures, and we have a lot of them. And you can be disciplined or you can receive discipline or conversations or low-level discipline, whatever it is, for every single policy we have in our manuals. And that's where laws, rules, and order come in. Force, obviously excessive force can be disciplined for that. Ethics, discrimination, relationships, there are specific policies about relationships. Access to confidential information that you don't have a need or a right to know. Efficiency, performance, people that are simply not completing the job up to par, you can be disciplined for that. Conduct, safety, of course, intoxicants, being under the influence of any type, that could be a cause for discipline as well. So within a administrative process within internal affairs investigations, at any point or even prior to the initiation of an internal affairs investigation, someone can be placed on administrative leave. Also, anybody involved in a critical incident, officer-involved shooting, per our protocol, is placed on administrative leave. But when we're talking about internal affairs investigation, if the case has the potential to result in termination of that employee, or the allegations are so egregious that we have found, based off of these definitions, they could not function as a police officer today. If those allegations were found to actually be true about them, they could be placed on administrative leave. A lot of times there's questions as to why would that be paid administrative leave. Let's say someone came in and said that I was sexually assaulted by a police officer. It's been going on for the last 3 years. And these are the different dates and times, and we have maybe some corroborating information that that person may have been there at the time. That could be a case where we place someone on administrative leave. Because if that were to be true, that case obviously could adversely affect them as being a police officer. However, until that investigation is actually complete, we don't know if that is actually, in fact, true. We have to do our due diligence. So that is why someone's put on paid administrative leave, because if we took them off completely or simply fired them based off of an allegation that walked through the door, that wouldn't give that person the opportunity to defend themselves, have an actual fair investigation. So when it comes to labor laws and all those things that are in place to protect any employee in any business, to make sure that they have a fair shake in an investigation, it is paid administrative leave. So we do a thorough investigation. Paid leave administrative investigations are ones that we go very quickly with because we understand that there is a need to have a decision based off of that, both for the employee and the employer. But that is why they're on paid administrative leave, because we have to go through all the processes that I led with to talk about giving that person a fair shake in the investigation. So I'm going to pass it back over to the chief to talk about uses of force. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Sure.
Is there anyone along the way who can say, we don't think this should go to IA, like it goes to the lieutenant, can they say, hey, this isn't worth sending to IA or whatever, or the captain or something?
Yes. Yeah, anywhere along there, you can have someone that says, I don't think this should go to that level of investigation. However, something like that where there may be a question or a discrepancy between two people, there's going to be a conversation at the captain level to say, well, let's talk about this and determine if it would meet the level of an internal affairs investigation. Fortunately for us, there isn't a lot of gray area when it comes to specific policy violations that make it just clear to send things to internal affairs, those high-level policy violations. It's the ones that I talked about that oftentimes are more informal to determine, okay, does this rise to that level? Is this a constant issue with the same particular person? That maybe we have more of those discussions about. But yes, technically somebody could along the way, whether it's a lieutenant, captain, chief, say, you know what, we can handle this. It doesn't meet any of the required instances that it has to go to internal affairs. We can handle this informally. As long as it's not a formal citizen complaint. That comes in and they say, I want to put pen to paper, I want to make a complaint, that has to go to IA, regardless of what anybody thinks. It has to be investigated on the internal affairs side.
And then I was just wondering, can you give us an idea of how many formal versus informal you get in a year? And then I was also wondering if an officer gets multiple informal, is that an issue?
Right. So yes, we're going to talk about audits, which actually is a piece of that, and we can talk about the number of administrative complaints versus informal. I'll tell you on average, and to talk about, because this is all information you probably have from some of the audits, typically in a year, formal complaints, both internally and externally generated, our department is about 60. I have the stats here, but when we get to audits, I'll cover that a little bit more. But, and to answer your question, yes, as supervisors, we should be looking. Did I get, in a 3-week period, 15 rudeness complaints from all different people all over the place? Those normally would be low-level violations, but if they're adding up and there's actually some merit to them, we can go back and look at body-worn camera, then yeah, we can make a decision. Is this something that should be handled at this level? Has there been intervention levels already to try to fix this problem, or is it continual, and that could lead into an internal affairs investigation? Yes. Yes. Her question was, is the complainant ever notified of the disposition of investigation? Great question. Yes, they are. However, it is based off of those definitions where I talked about sustained, not sustained, unfounded, exonerated. They would be provided that that person was, this allegation was found sustained. It would not tell you the level of discipline that they received, if they received any. And that comes from the Police Officer Bill of Rights. That piece is protected. So it's going to tell you what the investigation found, so whether it was unfounded, exonerated, sustained, not sustained, those levels, but it won't tell you what happened after that, if discipline was imposed. But it'll give you the finding and the definition.
As well.
Yes, because when you send in a formal complaint, you're going to get a letter that says your complaint has been received, and then it will tell you that we have this much time to investigate it. You're going to receive a disposition. When the case is over, you'll receive a letter that says we did investigate this incident and we found your complaint to be sustained or not sustained or unfounded, whatever that may be. But you will know the end result.
Okay, I had another question. Right here.
Yep.
So if they get that response back that it was unfounded, not sustained, are they able to appeal that?
You mean, can the citizen appeal that?
Yeah. If they really feel like there's something that you guys might have missed, can they appeal that decision?
Yeah. So no, there is not an appeal process for internal affairs investigations. Obviously, a phone call down to the internal affairs unit or talking to the investigating officer could be a piece of that, but no, there's not an appeal to that, not a process in place. Yes.
All right.
We had one more question here, sorry. I can hear you. I can repeat it if need be. Oh, sorry.
Officers can be fired from one department and then hired somewhere else. So is it true that officers can be fired from Modesto PD and go to the sheriff or to the next county or the county after that? What assures the public that that doesn't happen? Because we're confronted with that, like, well, these police officers that get fired, they just go somewhere else. It's like, okay, you think this is a game of safety? And so how do we assure the public that their safety is always protected?
So we're going to cover that as we move on to legislative updates. It'll be on there. But yes, at this point, there is the possibility that somebody could get fired from one agency and move to the other. But there's legislation that's coming down that'll prevent that in serious matter cases. And we'll explain that a little further.
The reason I bring this up because you said there's a thorough investigation, and I think that's on point. My question is on point. I want to know what you do when you find that somebody was fired somewhere else, but not what the politics are or what the legislature wants to do. I want to know what you do in your department. Please.
So
Thank you.
What I mentioned in the very beginning is we take into account, because we go to other agencies. If you work for another agency, then we go to that agency and look at the files. We do a thorough background investigation. Obviously, that is one piece of the puzzle in bringing something into our organization, making a decision off of that list that I had of all the things that we do as a hiring entity before we bring someone into the organization. So knowing that someone was fired from another agency, we're going to look at and make sure that we take that into consideration when we're looking at hiring somebody.
For instance, if you found out that somebody used excessive force and was fired because of that and was sustained, what would you do?
Yeah, Chief.
And I bring this up because it's really important in the community. Yep. We think that there's officers that just go somewhere else, and we need to pass a strict laws about that. And so that's why I think it's really important to talk about it right now.
Right. I can tell you as a chief of police, I don't want anybody else's problems. And so that's part of one of the things that happens before I hire anybody is that I have a full review of their file. I get the background investigation report, I get their personal history statement, I get the findings of the background investigation, and then I conduct a interview with that person, and I take everything into account. So there could be some time where, say, a few years ago, somebody was a police officer somewhere, and they got let go off the FTO field training program because they really were not very good at report writing. But then in the last 3 years, they went to college and they improved their report writing skills and something like that. Would that be something where maybe I would look at that person, look at their writing abilities, and maybe give them a shot at being a police officer again? Maybe. And those are the things that I take a look at. If someone's fired for excessive force from another agency or something egregious like that, I think it's going to be a very, very difficult time. It's not something that I would be willing to hire somebody as a Modesto police officer. If they had another investigation, either criminally or through an investigation of another agency that found that they were in violation of something egregious like that, it's not something that I would hire somebody at our police department. And I think to go along with the public sentiment around that same concern, what we'll cover in a little bit is now there's legislation here in California that talks about decertification, and once you're decertified, then you can't work as a police officer anywhere. And so, but I think your question was what do we do? Ends up, the final decision ends up with me, and I'm not going to hire anybody that doesn't fit the characteristics and the qualities and shares the core values of our community and the Modesto Police Department. So the short answer is no. Someone is either fired for something egregious, and I believe that is true. We're not going to be hiring them as a Modesto police officer.
I do have a little piggyback question off of that. So I'm just kind of curious, is there a system, or do you guys think there'll be a system in place of an officer that works, let's just say, on the East Coast? They get fired, they come to California, and then they're going through our process, but they just don't put that they were a police officer on the East Coast. Is there a system that you can like look them up and see that they were a police officer somewhere else?
I can tell you that if someone came from the East Coast and was a police officer there and made it here and went through our entire hiring process and we didn't hear that from a single person that we talked to, I'd be pretty disappointed in our own background investigations. Our background investigations are very, very thorough. Someone coming from out of state and we have zero info about that, we're going to go there and talk to family members, talk to neighbors that they live next door to, all those things to determine where that person's coming from, what their background actually is. So to say that there's a system, would be a system in place, I don't think there's going to be a system like California set up with decertification with very egregious acts. But if someone came from out of the state into our agency and they had a gap in employment somewhere and we were trying to figure out what that was and they were actually a police officer, we're going to dig and we're going to find that information. We're going to vet it out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And so I just want to, this is an excellent point about the parking lot. So it may be more questions that may arise around this particular subject. So we're going to add that to the parking lot so that we can move on.
All right, so just right before we move on, I wanted to just touch upon those questions a little bit. As one of the first slides that Chris showed, we only hire 3% of the applicants, so that just shows how thorough our process is. And during the background process, we do get your social security number, we run you through credit checks, and all that prior employment stuff comes out. So it would be almost nearly impossible for us not to catch that you were employed by a different agency. And any gaps in your public or in your personal history statement would be a red flag for us. We have to account for that time period. So those are just catch-alls. But moving forward with the use of force review process, we subscribe to a software company called Iapro, and they provide a suite of software, number one being Blue Team, and it helps us document our uses of force, pursuits, and damage of equipment. These are all things that we want to keep track at, and it creates an automated review process. It kind of follows the workflow that Lieutenant Adams kind of showed, where it goes to a sergeant, lieutenant, and captain, and we'll dive into it a little bit deeper as we move over. And the other part of that suite of software is Iapro, and that it gives us early identification and intervention, case management, and it also helps our internal affairs unit create audits. Say the chief wanted to know how many taser applications we had during a certain period, we can go to Iapro, ask for that request, and it'll print out that information for us. So it's very, it costs us money, but we subscribe to that software because it keeps us accountable for our uses of force and the way we manage training and all that results from those reviews. This is just a very simple graphic as to what occurs when there's a use of force. So there's a use of force incident. Per our policy, any officer that's involved in a use of force has to request a supervisor to come out. First thing they do is they assess for any medical aid if necessary, and then ask for a supervisor to respond. Once the supervisor arrives, he is then briefed of the incident. He makes contact with the arrestee, gets a brief statement, and takes photographs for documentation. So this is the very initial assessment of this incident. At this point, if a supervisor or any officer said, hey, there's something wrong with this, it can be automatically elevated to a different response than what we usually do through Blue Team. So this is just the first look at any use of force that we have. A supervisor review, so this is all that we take account. Obviously body camera footage, it's a big part, but it's not the only part. We also use the photos of the injured person, and those photos have to make sense with what the officer's saying occurred, right? If he's saying he struck the leg, but there's bruising in the back, that would be something we need to take further look. So then there's photos, there's police reports, witness statements, we take into account the suspect statement, physical evidence, also other digital media, right? There's cameras everywhere now, so we look for surveillance as well, and that has to match everything else that's being reported or being seen. We then compare that to department policy and law, and then we make a decision whether that use of force was within policy and lawful. Like I said, body-worn camera and video is a big part of accountability, so we've invested heavily on it. The Modesto Police Department deployed body-worn cameras in 2012. It was one of the largest agencies at the time to do so, and maybe definitely one of the first in the county and one of the first in the state as well. In 2021, we then added in-car cameras, which now gives us a forward-facing, which is referred to a dash cam. It also provides a camera to the back where we put prisoners so that they're monitored as well and audio recorded as well. There's always the manual activation on the body-worn camera. There's a button in the center of the camera. You hit that activates the camera. But we've also invested in having taser activation. So when anybody unholsters their taser and turns it on, that will then activate the person's camera. We're kind of automating the process, and in high-stress situations, we don't have to worry for the officer to push that himself. This activates the taser. Not only does it activate the wearer's camera, but anybody in close proximity, those cameras get activated as well. In 2021, we also went to a holster activation. So now if the gun leaves the holster, that then sends a signal to activate the wearer's camera and those people in the immediate area as well. Our police vehicle emergency lights, if an officer activates his emergency lights like he does in a traffic stop, that will then now activate the body-worn camera as well as the in-car camera as well. And then we have proximity activation, which I talked about. Anybody that's around that police vehicle and the lights go on, their cameras get turned on as well. So just a lot of redundancy in order for us to try to capture that video that's so important in these reviews. Use of force, this is what a Blue Team does for us. So an incident is entered into Blue Team and then it creates a digital file. You go back 10 years ago and it used to be a paper file. Now it's all digital. It emails, there's automated emails to keep the process moving and to make sure that nothing is left behind. So there's a use of force, a Blue Team file is created, associated reports get uploaded, photographs, videos, and any other digital evidence is attached to that digital file, and it's available for review in one area so that we don't have to scramble through different databases to try to find it. Once that file is created, a sergeant receives an email notification stating the incident is ready for review. So based on that review process that I showed with all those different bubbles, the sergeant looks at that incident and decides whether he believes the incident is within policy and lawful. He then sends that, he then enters that into the Blue Team, and then that automatically sends a notification to his lieutenant to conduct the same type of review. If the lieutenant agrees with it, he then sends it up the chain. If he disagrees, he can then send it back to the sergeant for additional information. Say he believes, if somebody forgot to add the photos, he can send that back. No, I need the photos. Sometimes photos aren't taken. When a subject is very combative and we aren't able to kind of get him still enough for us to take photos, then we have to articulate why photos weren't taken. Fortunately, there's usually body-worn camera video that captures that behavior, and we can go back to that body-worn camera video. So then he goes to lieutenant. The lieutenant decides, he gives his opinion based on policies, procedures, all the evidence available, whether that's if he believes it's within policy and lawful. And then that goes finally to the captain, and the captain then gives his review. If he believes everything is according to policy and procedure, then it just gets disposed, and then it goes to internal affairs where it gets stored in the Iapro software. At any point in the Blue Team process, if any of those people that I mentioned, the sergeant, the lieutenant, or the captain believe that it needs to be elevated to an internal affairs investigation, it can be done so. It doesn't have to be finalized or anything like that. It can just be sent based on the circumstances. A use of force as received as a citizen complaint shall be investigated by the internal affairs. So if there's a use of force, but there's a citizen complaint, that is an automatic, referral to the internal affairs unit. Now we're going to talk about Iapro. So it captures all of our uses of force, pursuits, and damage equipment report. Why is damage equipment important? If we have somebody that's, consistently, crashing a car, we want to know that, right? That could be a training issue. It could be somebody that, and we provide, training for that person, and if it continues, then that could be a possible liability for the city if you have an officer that's consistently crashing cars. So we want to know that. If they're constantly losing equipment, that could be a red flag for something else, so we want to be able to capture that, as well as pursuits and uses of force. If there are 6 uses of force of incidents within a rolling 12-month period, it generates another alert for the sergeant to take a look at that. Those uses of force don't disappear, but it just takes into account those 6, and now a sergeant has to again look at it, and look at it holistically now. So say each individual use of force was deemed justifiable, but now you're starting to see that 4 of those 6 involved a female. That could be a pattern. Maybe this person doesn't have the ability to engage with somebody from the opposite sex, or somehow they're just not able to talk well with females. We need to take a look at that closely. Say 5 of the 6 are drunk, people that are drunk in public or intoxicated. Maybe that officer's de-escalation skills are not to the point where they should be, and we need to take a look and see if there's something that could have been done better. So it just takes a holistic look at all the entire uses of force that created that review. So yeah, we're looking at demographics, we're looking at tactics, de-escalation, resources, strategies. Very common for a new officer, and I think I mentioned this in the past for policies and procedures, is when they go to a call by themselves. Usually somebody is more likely to challenge you if you go to the call by yourself, whether when there's two of you, they think about it a little bit more and you don't have those issues. So that could be a training problem that we need to address with that officer. So once again, that Iapro alert goes to the sergeant. They do an analysis that gets reviewed by a lieutenant and then a captain, and they all have to agree that there is no pattern or concern, or if there is a pattern or concern, that it's being dealt with appropriately. Like I said, the most common one is usually a training thing where it's a newer officer going to call by themselves where they could have, waited for backup, or even just learning that sometimes, if I'm encountering somebody from like Chris and my distance, and I say, hey, Chris, I need you to turn around because you have a warrant for your arrest, very likely that he may just take off on me because he has that separation. So those are little things that we look for that can be kind of addressed through training. Officer-involved shootings. When a shooting occurs, obviously, I think most of us now have heard it. There's 3 different investigations that occurred. Now, this is when a subject is armed. Things have now changed for unarmed people, and we'll kind of address that. But say this shooting occurs, the subject is armed, there's a criminal investigation. The agency that has jurisdiction is responsible for that criminal investigation. If our officers are conducting an investigation, it takes them to the city of Ceres, and they get involved into an officer-involved shooting, the criminal investigation portion will be investigated by the Ceres Police Department. If it happens in our jurisdiction, then we are responsible for that investigation. There's an internal affairs investigation, and that is to look for policies and procedures and training to make sure that it's all accountable. And then there's the district attorney conducts their own independent investigation. Shortly after a shooting occurs or any type of critical incident, we do a 72-hour critical incident review. And that's composed of the executive team, the captains, the assistant chief, and the chief. And we look at that incident to see if there's anything immediately that has to be addressed, with training, with our policies, with our procedures, equipment. That's our very first look. If there's anything, then that gives us the opportunity to address it immediately. Typically, when an officer is involved in a shooting, they're put on administrative leave, so that gives us a little bit of time to address any issues, and if we need to extend that administrative leave because of something we recognize in the 72-hour review, that's where we do it. So 1506, signed into law effective January 1st, 2021, authorizes the State Attorney General to investigate officer-involved shootings of unarmed civilians. It requires the Attorney General to prepare an investigation report and post on the internet those findings. Requires the Attorney General to prosecute criminal actions as warranted against any police officer. So that now it takes it away from the district attorney's office if that needs to happen, and now it's done on the state level by the Department of Justice and the Attorney General's office. So the one thing that changes with an unarmed subject is now we have the Department of Justice through the Attorney General's office that comes in and conducts the investigation as well, parallel to all the other ones. And like we stated, those reports now become public when the investigations are concluded. Then they are now required to post those on the internet for everybody's review.
And sorry, is that mandatory that the AG take the investigation, or do they just have the option?
Of unarmed subjects, it is, okay. Yes. And so how that process works is once we get an incident that involves somebody that was unarmed, we make a phone call, and then that activates their response.
Yes, that's the new, and it's in effect now. So if we have an incident like that, we have to call DOJ to inform them of an unarmed person. Yeah,
so that was effective January 1st, 2021.
Can you kind of describe the definition of unarmed? Like, is it just, what if they had like a pocket knife, is that considered armed, or like a blade that's considered armed?
So an unarmed person is truly no weapon whatsoever. So they go very specific. Obviously, if they talk about someone having a knife, they would consider them armed. A gun, even something, an object that could commit deadly force, like if someone had a boulder in their hand. By definition, that could be assault with a deadly weapon, could cause death or serious bodily injury. So if they have an object that meets those definitions, then they would consider being armed. But someone that didn't have any type of weapon whatsoever would be an unarmed person. They would look at those. that looks like a weapon. No, that would be one that would be considered unarmed. Yeah. Yes.
Aren't those only in cases where there's an actual death?
Yes, thank you for that
It
clarification.
isn't just a shooting, it's a death.
Correct. That occurs in death, thank you.
All right, if there's no further questions, this is the 72-hour critical incident review. I kind of already went over it, but it occurs in close proximity to 72 hours after an incident occurred. Like I said, includes the executive staff, our training staff, and the city attorney's office. Used to determine any immediate needs for change in policy, equipment, or training. Not used to determine if the incident's in or out of policy. Includes in-custody death, officers-involved shootings, and any other incident deemed critical. So an in-custody death, say our officers are involved trying to detain a subject, and for some reason that subject experienced a medical emergency, passes away, this would qualify for a 72-hour review.
So in talking about alerts, and I'm going to go into audits here in a second, but when we talk about the different levels of review, when we talk about a use of force or a pursuit, or if we have an alert that comes through 6 uses of force within that 12-month period, they're looked at every level for 2 reasons. One is they're looked at to make sure that incident, whether it was in policy or out of policy, if there's training issues associated. The reason why it moves up the chain too is because each level has to look at it from a different perspective. The sergeant obviously is looking at that individual incident. Is this within policy? Is it out of policy? Is it in policy with training issues? Whatever that may be. The lieutenant has a much broader view of his shift, his or her shift, all the people that work under them. He has a couple different sergeants, several different officers. They're starting to look at, are we seeing patterns at this level within my own shift that works for me, my own platoon that works for me? So they're not just looking at that individual incident, they're also saying, okay, is there an issue that we're seeing across the board with, for the example the chief gave, is my shift having trouble dealing with drunk people, and are we using force on pretty much every drunk person we come across? That could be an issue. Then it gets to the captain level. The captain is overseeing the entire division and sees every single use of force that comes through for that division. In our operations division, typically the boots on the ground people that are working, that's where most of our uses of force come from, because it's from patrol-related activities, calls for service. They're looking at department-wide. Are there things that we should be looking at as far as training, policy, procedure? So every level is, of course, looking at that incident, but as you get higher and higher and you see more of them, you're also looking at that holistic view to say, okay, is there an issue here? Is there something we need to be doing as a division, as an organization, to make sure that we're keeping our officers safe, we're keeping our citizens safe? What should we be doing in that instance? So that's the same thing when I jump into audits here that we're doing, is now we're looking at several years of information. What kind of patterns are we seeing? What kind of information's out there? Any changes we need to make? So real quick, when we talked about alerts, or we talk about these 72-hour reviews, we talk about all the things we do. Police officers are a lot of self-reflection. In every single call for service we go to, debriefs of serving a search warrant, there's a lot of self-reflection that goes into that within small teams and as an organization. So we put up a couple examples here of things that have happened, incidents particularly that have happened that have created policy changes, created that internal reflection, things that we found we needed to do something different. When we talk about beanbag usage, we have changed our policy within the last few years about dual verification when it comes to utilizing a beanbag gun, to make sure that 2 people can determine that that is the correct round that's going into a less lethal beanbag round, and there's not a lethal round within that. Slow speed traffic collision training. We saw a pattern for a period of time where most of our collisions were not high speed, they were low speed, backing into things, hitting parked cars, hitting poles in the back parking lot, and that was a pattern that was consistent. So we implemented, I believe it's annually now, a slow speed EVOC course of some, and I say EVOC, emergency vehicle operations, a slow speed course because we found that there was an issue with slow speed driving, and that becomes from alerts. That comes looking holistically at the collisions that we're having. Chief, did you want to cover this one, talking about policy changes?
Yeah, policy changes recently, face strikes. Now they're kind of a last resort where they weren't before. that was a recent change. I'll let Chris talk about officer-involved reintegration because he was part of that.
Yeah. So we found a need when we talk about being involved in a use of force can be a traumatic incident for everybody involved, but an officer-involved shooting, of course. Making sure that the officers mentally, when they go back into the field, are in a good place for them personally. Well, there's a lot of processes in place, administrative leave, meeting with the department psychologist to make sure that officer feels comfortable. But as we know, there's a lot of things that can happen in life in general that trigger certain feelings that come into play in our everyday life. So officer-involved shootings can do that. It's a pretty traumatic incident for everyone involved. So the implementation of a reintegration course where we're simply putting our officers in situation scenarios, not retraining, not reteaching anything, not pointing blame to say they did anything wrong, but putting them back in an entry into a building, putting them back on a call for service that maybe was similar to the incident that led to an officer-involved shooting. Going out and doing a simple bike stop because certain things that you do in this field could trigger a response that you're just not used to, that emotional, psychological response. So again, not a retraining by any means, because that all comes later if we find it in the long-term investigation, but how we get that officer to know what it's like to be back in the field, so the first time they're dealing with a call for service, it's exactly the same as their OIS, it's not in real world. Let's put them through some type of scenario, just so they can feel that internally. So that's a recent implementation that we made. Talking about search warrant services, we've changed a lot over the years. You can go back to the Sepulveda incident in early 2000s that generated briefbacks before I go into a search warrant. Who is in charge of what? What is your job when you get in there? What weapons are you actually carrying when you go in? And talking about that incident afterwards. What did I do wrong? What did I do right? What tactics can we maybe change? And that's on an everyday basis that we're talking about those incidents. Do you want to go over the matrix?
Yeah, I'll go over the high-risk matrix. It's a form that we fill, and it just identifies any hazards or potential red flags so that we don't encounter those. One of those things being if there's we know there's a vicious dog in the residence, we prepare for that with alternatives to respond to that dog, like snares. Even tasers work fairly well to keep a dog away. Children, we have to account for those. When we do search warrants, we prefer that the children are not at home. So if they're school age, we prefer that they're at school. That'd be a more optimal time to serve that warrant. When we go back to search warrants deployment strategies, if you go back, before the early 2000s, a lot of our entries were standard entries where you knock on the door, give sufficient time, 30 seconds or a little bit about that, and then you force the door open and you enter and you serve the warrant there. Now our strategy is more to surround and call out. So we'll surround, create a perimeter, use a PA, make loud announcements, make phone calls into the residence, and try to account for everybody that way instead of forcing the door open and entering. When we have the ability to do so. A lot of times now, when we want to serve a warrant, the subject is deemed a risk because of violent history. Sometimes we wait until the subject leaves the house and we take them into custody outside the house, and then now we can more safely serve the search warrant at the residence. Safety checks, because of the Sepulveda incident. Now, before we do a search warrant, we check the officer's equipment and make sure there's nothing that's going to interfere that'll trigger something else. So those were implemented after that. And obviously rear-facing cameras were important as well. Now we can account for anything that happens in the backseat of a patrol car. And these are all changes made after we reviewed incidences and felt that it was important for us to make those changes.
Question behind you.
The face strike policy change, what exactly was the change in policy?
It's now it's kind of a last resort, basically, to answer your question. If there's no other means of the officer to defend himself, then he can then proceed to a face strike. But he would have to exhaust, mentally you'd have to exhaust all different options if at all possible.
And what's the definition of a face strike?
Any strike to the face, right? It could be closed fist, open fist, anything that hits the head.
And what was the policy before this change?
It wasn't like a last resort type of use of force option. So we had a recent incident where we looked at that, and historically, our officers get hurt more when they use face strikes with their hand. It causes fractures. It's not the best tool, but we do recognize that it could be a last resort type of of option, and if the officer needs that to protect himself, protect his life or somebody else's, it's allowable.
Oh, sorry. All right, there we go. And then just if I can add something. So on that, something that we made this change over the last year, and it was something that regardless of whether something was in policy or legally allowed by law, I wanted to make sure that we sent a message to officers that while it may be legal and it may be authorized by law, again, and I've made this statement before, it just doesn't look good. And so I want us to train, and we do train pugilistics and different things like that, because at the end of the day, it just, under the law, it has to be reasonable, right? And that's how we evaluate reasonable force. But I want to emphasize that we want to use as any other tactics possible and stay safe at the same time and avoid face strikes when possible. And so that is a policy change that we made over this last year, because no matter how justified it is, it just doesn't look good, right? And so we still evaluate. It doesn't mean that I evaluate force any different, and it doesn't mean that it's prohibited, but we want, if we can, to avoid those because they don't look good. I've seen in my 20-year career, many people break knuckles and boxers fractures and all that type of stuff, so it injures officers. Oftentimes it's not that effective in stopping the attack or stopping the resisting person. And so there's other means, if possible and when appropriate, that I want our officers not to use that tactic. So it doesn't mean it's never appropriate, doesn't mean that it will never happen. We'll still evaluate it, but I wanted something in policy to guide them away from that when possible, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Before we move on, right here, I got another question. So I can't remember your name.
Chris,
sorry.
yeah.
You were talking about the therapists for officers involved shooting and stuff like that. In the policy, though, it says that it's upon request and it's not mandatory. And so when you were talking about it, it kind of sounded like it was mandatory. So I just wanted to clarify, is it mandatory or is it upon request?
With, when you're talking about officer-involved shootings?
Shooting and the officer involved.
You have to have a conversation of some sort with our department psychologist following an officer-involved shooting to say that's an in-person meeting or whatever that may be, but you're going to have at least a conversation, some outreach between the two of you to have that connection.
If there are no other questions right now, I thought this might be a good time for a brief break, just so that everyone stretches their legs, use the restroom. I also want to remind everyone to please
group assignments on the board back there. Put a check mark if it's good. Take your name off if you're a little overextended, especially if you have multiple assignments back there. And let's come back at 7:10. shape right now, but I know Kate is going to, for those of you who are virtual, who weren't able to come up to the flip charts. Sorry, we're just going to get started again. All right, cool. For those of you who are on Zoom who weren't able to go up to the flip charts, Kate is going to email you a picture so that you can look and just email her back and let her know if you need to be added or removed. And with that, I'll turn it back over to staff.
All right. So I'm going to briefly talk about audits. As I alluded to previously, we talked about early intervention, or actually before I do that, before the break, I was asked a question about the department psychologist, and I looked up and saw, I don't know your first name, but you'd asked me a question about mandatory meeting with a psychologist before return to duty. Yes, it is mandatory. When we were looking at the policy together, where it is optional is if another department member that was affected by the incident wants to talk to the psychologist, meaning a non-shooter, someone that wasn't involved directly in that critical incident. They obviously can talk to our psychologist at any time, but it is mandatory for an officer who's involved in an officer-involved shooting to meet with the department psychologist before returning to duty. It's in our policy, and it's also indicated in the administrative leave order that they're given the day that that incident occurs. Question?
Do you have full-time? I don't know, is this on? Hello? Do you have a full-time psychologist available to the officers in the department?
Yes. Yes. So moving into audits, when we talk about early interventions, in individual uses of force or pursuits and looking at patterns of behavior, whatever that may be, to make sure our officers are just better at what they do. Audits are a much higher level view of those types of things, and we audit pretty much all of our processes that we have. Some of the ones that I think you guys obviously would like to know most about, while I'm going to talk about that we do these audits, I think in these additional meetings is we're going to dive more into the data in these types of audits, but the particular audits that we do every single year get that high level look at year-to-date information and looking at past history of where we're at with these certain types of audits and information to make sure that there's not patterns of behavior that are concerning or sending us in a direction where we need to do something to mitigate or change that to make our citizens safer or officers safer. So when we look at bias-based policing audits required by law, we have to report information to the Department of Justice every single year. And as the chief is going to talk shortly with new legislation, there's additional information that's reported that helps track this information to make sure there's not patterns of behavior when it comes to bias-based policing. We do a use of force audit every single year, and that is taking all of the uses of force within an entire year. That has to be reported to the Department of Justice, but also, and theirs is a very basic level, looking at it, how many did you have, the types of force that was used, number of injuries to citizens, number of injuries to officers, just more of a numbers. We as a department internally really drill down into what that data actually means, the different types of force used, the people involved in those uses of force, both citizens and officers, and are there patterns of things that we need to be working on? Is there equipment that is out there? Is there training that's out there? Is there things that we can be doing to help make sure that our uses of force are not just all against one type of person, as we mentioned, someone that may be intoxicated? Are they just using one type of tool and they're not trying to use de-escalation tactics, or they're simply going to their taser every time someone gets mouthy with them? Those types of things we're looking at a holistic view, year in and year out from a higher level. We also look at internal affairs, and I think we mentioned this earlier about number of complaints that come in, both citizen and with internally generated complaints or administrative investigations. We look at those. And on average, when I look back at our statistics, we usually hover around that 55, 58 every single year, about a total number of internal affairs investigations that we have. And so we look at those numbers, both the internal and externally generated complaints, and determine what may have made changes in that and what are things that we need to be doing as an organization to reduce that, to increase the clearance rate, to do some type of training, to do some type of public education, whatever that may be. So we do that as well throughout the year. These are the other audits that we complete at the department. We do pursuit audits, so every single year we look at all the pursuits. We didn't really go down this avenue when we talked about alerts, but there's also in our Blue Team Iapro system, if someone gets in a pursuit 3 or more within a 12-month period, we get an alert and it says, we need to look at these 3 pursuits and we need to see if there's patterns associated with that. So we also do a pursuit review and we compare that to years past. How many pursuits are we getting in? What types of crimes are we chasing people for? What is the end of the pursuit? Did we terminate it ourselves? Did a supervisor terminate it? Did it end in a crash? So we're looking at those patterns year in and year out. And we do this every single year. We also look at property and evidence. We have to do an audit every single year of all of the property that's in property and evidence. They pull random samples, random cases, and go determine is this item of evidence where it's supposed to be to make sure that we're keeping track of our property and evidence flows. Employee grievance, internally generated complaints, making a grievance complaint within our organizations, we audit that information too. Asset forfeiture funds, if we do an audit on that every single year for funds that are seized through illegal means, drug activity, what that may be, we actually audit that information. While there's a whole process in place before you can seize any money, we also audit it every single year. CLETS, which is our database where we receive all our information about people and stuff. If I run somebody's name for a criminal history or for a driver license check, there's audits on that. Department of Justice actually audits us every year, and it's usually by surprise. They don't have on January 1, we're going to do an audit. They let us know, hey, we're doing an audit. This is the day that we're coming, and these are the hits that you've already ran that we're going to look at. So be ready to talk about them. So that's always happening as well. Any donations that come into the police department, if you have organizations that donate, for example, Home Depot sometimes for like an Explorer competition will donate a pallet of water. Well, we have to track that information coming in, so we audit that information. And then ISD funds, which is our investigative services division, they're allotted money. It's city money, but city money to do undercover transactions of illegal narcotics or property or what that may be. If they have that cash, we also audit that information. So we're going to jump into police personnel records.
So police personnel records is where we're seeing a lot of the legislative change that's been implemented recently. But we have to go back to 832.7, both subsection A and B of the Penal Code prohibit us, any state or local, which being a city or a county, from releasing public records. So this is what causes a lot of the frustration, right? When somebody makes a complaint and all we can give is a disposition, can't tell them, you know, what discipline may have occurred from that, or that these are the reasons why it was exonerated or unfounded. We're just prohibited from doing so. And it causes, you know, issues for both the citizen, on the citizen side, because people want to know, and also internally, we want you to know, and things could be resolved, and a lot of misinformation can be, you know, stopped if we were able, had the ability to release this information as an organization. So SB 1421 was approved in September of 2018. This kind of helps amend that 832.7 section, where now certain information is now releasable if it fits under these categories. So officer shooting at another person, officer of use of force causing death or great bodily injury against a person, officer sexually assaulting a person, sustained allegation of officer dishonesty about a crime or misconduct of another. Now this kind of helps us circumvent that previous penal code. AB, Assembly Bill 748, video and audio recordings, was also approved in September of 2018. It amends other sections that kind of protected this type of digital evidence, but it requires that video of a critical incident be released within 45 days, absent certain exceptions. Critical incidents include an incident involving the discharge of a firearm at a person by a peace officer or custodial officer, an incident in which the use of force by a peace officer or custodial officer against a person resulted in death or great bodily injury. So in those cases, now you see these videos being introduced by different agencies. Our agencies, we call them community briefs, and we now present these videos within that 45-day period. Assembly Bill 953, California Racial and Identity Profiling Act. We internally call it RIPA for short, but now it creates the Racial and Identity Profile Advisory Board. It's composed of both public, law enforcement, and educators, aims to strengthen the law enforcement community relations through transparency and accountability, collects data regarding citizen complaints alleging racial and identity profiling, and also requires annual reports to the Attorney General on data that's accumulated during stops. So there's 15 items here. Some of that is, location of the stop, perceived race or ethnicity of the person, perceived gender of person stopped, person perceived to be LGBT, perceived age of person. So now we have to account for all these criteria and mark them so that it can now be tracked by the state, and we provide that to them as well.
And that actually, for us, so that bill came out about 4 years ago or so, and but it started with agency size where they implemented it. So larger agencies had to do that first, and then it kind of trickled down to agencies smaller as they went down. So starting January 1 of 2022, we're required to enter that information for every single stop that we do. That's a state mandate. We're already testing that, and we have been for the last few months, and the software that goes behind that. But any single detention of a person while working as a police officer, you're required to fill that information out and enter it, and it gets sent to the Department of Justice.
So
How do you ascertain that information?
So a couple different ways. It's a lot of it is based off of perception, what your perception is at that time. It's not necessarily asking certain questions. It could come from identifying information on a driver's license or running somebody's name or that. But what Department of Justice is looking for is based off of what your perception is prior to talking to that person and then after you talk to that person. So it's based off of your personal belief as you engage with that person.
So part of that Assembly bill is the creation of this role or the Racial and Identity Profile Advisory Board. So the Attorney General was mandated to create this board. It's a 19-member board made up of law enforcement attorneys, community and spiritual leaders, and a university professor for the purpose of eliminating racial and identity profiling. So they advised the Attorney General in developing the regulations for the stop data collection. So all those 15 different criteria that was developed by this advisory board. Annual review and analyze the stop data and citizen complaint data submitted by law enforcement. Work with law enforcement to review and analyze racial and identity profiling policies and practices. Issue an annual report that details the past and current status of racial and identity profiling and provides policy recommendations for eliminating profiling in California. SB 16, this, when we talked about 1421, this further enhances the 1421. So it was approved again September of 2021, expands access to police misconduct records. Misconduct records retention increased from 5 to 15 years now. So at 5 years, we were mandated to purge these files. Now we have to retain them to 15 years. Requires misconduct records to be released even if the officer quits before the investigation is completed. Discloses information regarding officers found to engage in biased or discriminatory behavior, unlawful arrests or searches, use force that is excessive, unreasonable, or fail to intervene.
So when we talk about this law specifically, when you rewind back to SB 1421, the specific things, if you're lying as a police officer, sexual assault, involved in a use of force that resulted in injury or death, officer-involved shooting. So those changes back then, we had to release those files, meaning we had anybody that came in and did a public request act for it, we had to provide that information with redactions, meaning witness information, personal identifying information. But at that time, it was retroactive, meaning any files that we had in our department, which we retained files for 5 years, we turned over all of those investigations to anybody that asked. This now expands that a couple different ways. One, we're going to begin holding our records for 15 years, so 10 years longer than we ever have before. And those records that now have a list of things that we would be required to turn over if someone did a public request act, meaning that excessive force. If we go back to, and we kind of alluded to the conversation tonight when we talk about the Alonso Nunez case and some people asking specifically about that, that falls under to where we are not able to disclose, other than to a complainant, the result of that case. This law changes that. It's not retroactive in the sense that that case would fall in there, but it would, going forward, allow that information to be released through a PRA. So now we go to SB2, and SB2 is commonly known as the Decertification
Bill, and I know somebody asked about, if somebody was fired from a place, can they now get employment in another agency or come from another state? So it was approved in September of 2021. It creates a process of police officer decertification, revises disqualifying criteria for certification, requires all law enforcement agencies within the state to investigate and report all crimes, allegations, and findings of serious misconduct regardless of the officer's employment or status. So no longer, can you say, I want to quit in lieu of, now we have to continue with that investigation and find it at the end and close it out. Let's see. Revises and removes immunity provisions for police officers and public agencies employing them in lawsuits brought under the state's Tom Bain Civil Rights Act. And now this also creates another accountability division that's mandated by the Attorney General. And now this board will now hear all these allegations or complaints that are brought, and as well as shootings. It's a 9-member board, and right here we go into the makeup of the board. So this board has to be created no later than January 2023. The governor should establish the Peace Officer Standards Accountability Advisory Board. The purpose of the board shall be to make recommendations on the decertification of peace officers to the commission, which is post, when they talk about the commission. The protection of public and all constitutional and statutory rights shall be the highest priority of the board as it upholds the standards for peace officers in California. The board shall consist of 9 members as follows. 1 member should be a police officer or former peace officer with substantial experience at a command rank appointed by the governor. 1 member shall be a peace officer or former peace officer with substantial experience at the management rank in internal investigations or disciplinary proceedings of peace officers appointed by the governor. 2 members shall be members of the public who shall not be former peace officers who have substantial experience working at nonprofit or academic institutions on issues related to police accountability. 1 of these members shall be appointed by the governor and 1 by the Speaker of the Assembly. 2 shall be members of the public who shall not be former peace officers who have substantial experience working at community-based organizations on issues related to police accountability. 1 of these members shall be appointed by the governor and 1 by the Senate Rules Committee. 2 members shall be members of the public who shall not be former peace officers, with strong consideration given to individuals who have been subject to wrongful use of force likely to cause death or serious bodily injury by a peace officer, or who are surviving family members of a person killed by the wrongful use of deadly force by a peace officer appointed by the governor. 1 member shall be an attorney who shall not be a former peace officer with substantial professional experience involving oversight of peace officers appointed by the governor. And then future projects that we're looking at as well that we want to accomplish in 2022 is that we want to create forward-facing dashboards with up-to-date information on complaints and audit information. That way we don't have to, you as a citizen do not have to wait for a yearly report. You can go to the department's homepage, click on a link, and now you're routed to a dashboard that gives up-to-date information regarding complaints, uses of force, and that type of information. Our annual reports, we want to include additional audit information. We do include some there, but we want it to be more robust and more thorough. And then we're looking at technology to allow us to conduct community surveys after an encounter with an officer. Then there's a link sent either through a text or email allowing you to fill the survey so you can report back on your experience with that officer on that occasion. And with that, we open it up to questions.
All right, and I just want to make a little space for especially our work group members on Zoom. I know it can be hard to get a word in. And if not, just questions from anyone.
I'll see. I have to have my microphone turned on. There we go. So I've got a couple questions. One is when you talk about the number of use of force incidents and you guys have to report that. So I was wondering how many that typically is annually.
So in just looking at average for the last 3 years, approximately 200. Without delving into every single year and drilling down but approximately 200 within a calendar year. Yeah.
And then when you were talking about complaints and deciding discipline, what are types of discipline that a police officer might encounter?
Sure. So by standard definition, we talk about discipline. I'll first tell you, outside of discipline, a lot of measures go into hand. If we come across someone that is struggling in a particular area, a lot of retraining that goes in, but that's not discipline by definition. But that stuff happens all the time. Conversations about how you interact with someone, additional training for driving or talking or interacting or de-escalation, which is basic, just how police function. We're trying to get better all the time. But for when you talk about discipline, written reprimand being the lowest level of discipline, other types of discipline would be days off without pay, demotion, reassignment, reduction in pay in general, termination. Those types of things would be different disciplines that are often imposed if it gets to that point.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering if we could back up just a little bit, because you were talking on Penal Code 832.7, except as provided the personnel records of peace officers and custodial officers, and you were talking about how that was frustrating for both the public complainant possibly and for the police officers. I'm getting a little lost in why that interferes with.
Yeah, sometimes we can resolve an issue by just informing the public this is what occurred in this specific case. This was a discipline that was imposed, and maybe that would satisfy the public's curiosity with that case or interest in that case. But as an agency, as a government, we're a city organization. We can't provide that to you, so that could be internally frustrating to us. Where we could resolve this issue, we just have the ability to kind of relay that information. And sometimes our hands are tied from doing that because of this law that's in place.
You could have a particular incident that maybe becomes very well known in the public, and the way that the law is written and Police Officer Bill of Rights and all those things behind it, we can't come out as an organization and say, hey, we're aware of this incident and we disciplined that officer and we gave them this discipline. All we can do is, based off of a citizen complaint, tell the citizen that made the complaint that this allegation was sustained, not sustained, unfounded, exonerated, whatever that may be, and that's all that we can do. It's limited. So sometimes that community satisfaction of knowing that, I felt that officer should have got A, B, and C. If they did, we couldn't confirm that in a public setting, or if they feel officer, they did nothing wrong and nothing should have happened, I can't come out and say we did nothing to that officer because they didn't do anything wrong, simply because of those protections within there. So sometimes the public can feel that lack of satisfaction and end result. Correct.
Is there any, do you have ever any opportunities for maybe some kind of discussion between a citizen who thought they were wronged in some way and the police officer, where they could explain what their thought or opinion was at the time, and the other person could say, well, this is why it bothered me, and then kind of resolve it that way? Is there anything like that ever takes place?
It depends. When I talked about formal versus informal complaint, if something turns into a formal complaint, a lot of those protections come in for both the citizen and for the officer about where this information goes, where the investigation goes. Informal, which is more common when it's a misunderstanding in procedure, or I just didn't like the way this call resulted, those conversations happen every day, because it's a supervisor talking to that citizen, getting the information, watching a body-worn camera and saying, hey, this is what happened here. And I'm sorry that maybe the officer was upset, or there was a discourteous statement that was made to say, this is why this happened that way, and there's more of that explanation. But when you get into the realm of formal complaints, outside of now what legislation has put into place where we do have to release that information, it limits that conversation somewhat from what you're talking about.
And can you hear me? There we go. I'll just add to that a little bit so as the chief, sometimes I'll get phone calls from citizens that want to meet with me and talk about either maybe a specific case in general, and it may not even be an internal investigations case. Like, I'll give you an example. I had a conversation, had a father call me this past year and wanted to meet with me because it was a Hispanic male and a Hispanic father. And they thought some of the questions by the officers that stopped them felt like it was racially profiling. And so he didn't want to make a formal complaint, but he wanted me to be aware, and he wanted to sit down and have a conversation. And so I was able to review the body camera video and sit down and talk with this parent and the child and explain what I perceived and have a very good discussion about the questions that were being asked, why the officers may have asked those questions based on the specific assignment that they were doing and the area that they were working and the things that had been going on in that area. And I think it eased a lot of the tension of what that doesn't mean. At the same time, though, I was able to go back to the supervisor of those officers and say, well, let's have a discussion, because make them aware that they were perceived by having this conversation and the perception that the questions they were asking had on this young man. And this was like a 16-year-old kid. You know, those are, in my opinion, the conversations that really produce a lot of perspective on both sides. Me as the police chief can relay those perspectives, but then it also allows a citizen to come in and have that back and forth conversation. But with as far as kind of just to piggyback what the discussion we're having with far as releasing records, you know, we have to follow personnel, right? There's laws in place, just like for any organization, that says, as an employee, you're of any organization, that your personnel records are protected, and there's, you know, no one wants to go and have everything that they are talked to, counseled about, or things like that, just out in the public. And no doubt in government or in law enforcement, public has a heavy interest in what happens in law enforcement, especially when it comes to discipline. And that's why a lot of these laws, and we see more and more of them every year, right, come out to say, okay, here's what you had to release. Guess what? Now here's what you have to release. And when I say have to release, it's not that we don't want to, but we have to follow exactly what the law says, because, you know, on one, it's that balance of trying to make sure the law is there to protect employees and make sure that everything that they do isn't put out in the public, but the laws talks about, you know, egregious things, and that's what 1421 talks. It talks about serious misconduct and things like that. SB2 follows that and expands it even more. They're still working in SB2. They're still working on the definition of what serious misconduct is. And if it falls into those exceptions, then those records become released. And so I know Chris mentioned it, but this is kind of could be part of the frustrating part is if you listen to the city council members, you know, there's, and I don't mind saying the name just because it comes up every city council meeting, it sounds like, but there's public comment about the Alonzo Nudez case, which Lieutenant Adams talked about. But we determined that doesn't fall in an exception to the law, so we aren't legally able to give any comment on that investigation. That was an internal affairs investigation because there was a citizen complaint, but it doesn't fall into a law exception, so we can't mention anything about it. I can't step up to the dais and talk about that investigation, if that makes sense.
I was just thinking there could be an opportunity then in the informal type for it to be a win-win situation where there could be things that the officer would learn by hearing the perspective of the grievance that was presented, and there could be things that the citizen could learn from where the perspective, you know, of the officer. And to me, that could be a win-win if there could be some kind of mechanism that it could be, you know, it could be handled that way.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and that happens on occasion. But I think what you're talking about is having some formal mechanism that would help alleviate those type of things. So no, point taken.
I think too, just to add on to the back end of that, is when I talk about the informal complaints that may come in, it's oftentimes through watch commander role, which I just left recently. And I'll tell you, at that level, and our lieutenants that work watch commander roles, very good relationship with their sergeants and expectations is when someone calls in and says, this officer did A, B, and C, and I don't like it, I don't want to make a formal complaint, but let's talk about it. They're looking and saying, okay, well, let's see if there's some validity to this because we want to make our officers better if that's the case. But at the same time, I also want to be able to educate the citizen if we did everything that we needed to and tell them. So while there maybe not be a formal process that comes into place, those conversations are happening a lot because the lieutenants are relaying it to their sergeants or bringing it to a briefing training. Maybe it's not singling out the officer, but saying, hey, in this instance, we found that we could do better here, so we give an entire briefing training so everyone kind of learns from that particular incident. So they're constantly reflecting on that stuff when people call in and tell us, hey, I think you could have done a better job in this instance.
But but we all know that transparency, right, especially around accountability and different things like that, is a very hot button topic. And so I think it was on your last slide, and you mentioned it. But one of the things we're trying to do is really continue as we go forward. Look at we talk about forward-facing dashboards. We have these reports that you guys all received with our use of force audits and pursuit audits and things like that. But we want to, where we're going, and I hope to have that happen in 2022, is to have electronic dashboards where this stuff is just publicly put out. And you don't have to wait till the end of the year. That we'll update it hopefully on a monthly basis and give general, because we can give general updates, right? We can say we had so many complaints this month, or here's the disposition of, and I don't know if we do that on a monthly basis, but maybe we do it on a quarterly, or at some point we put out what the dispositions are, because those are all in your binders and information, and I think a lot of people are very curious about that information, and rightfully so. So it's just putting that out there, because again, we want to be as transparent as possible, but we also have to protect employee rights as well, and so it's that fine balance. And so there is information we want to put out, and we will continue to put out. When I look at our annual report and what we are going to put out, for 2021 as we go forward, what I'm finding, and you guys may have seen the same thing, is we put out a lot of information and statistics, but we probably need to be a little bit more comprehensive. And so when we look at this, looking at what we're going to put out for 2021, I think I know we are going to make it much more comprehensive, and some of the audits that you guys have will be included in that comprehensive annual report going forward to the public. So those are the things we're looking at, is how do we get more information out to the public? It's not just at a committee meeting when people ask for it, or end of year report. How do we do it on an ongoing basis so that people can go and take a look at what's going on, not in real time, but monthly basis or something to that effect.
So I know we don't want to get too deep into specific incidents, but since we're kind of there, I feel the need to ask about in SB 1421 the great bodily injury clause. In the Alonzo Nunez case, there were reports that that man was hospitalized for 2 days, that there were reports that he lost teeth in that incident. Now, maybe you have additional context on that. Maybe all the information that was reported wasn't accurate, but certainly looking at that video, just in a common sense, kind of plain language sense, it certainly looked serious, and a lot of people would say disturbing. So to whatever extent you're able to comment specifically or generally, what is your process for deciding when a case like that meets that great bodily injury?
Typically what we do is we coordinate with our city attorney's office, because it's an easy word to say, but it's a difficult one to draw a bright line on, right? And so, again, not being able to go in specifics, but I guess what I would say just is, in generally, we coordinate with our city attorney's office to see if it's something that, in their opinion, that it needs to be disclosed or not be disclosed. And again, that's that fine balance and all that.
Hi. We were provided with a memo from Aaron Tate to the chief that was dated in April, and it went through and it cited sort of a summary of the use of force incidents. But based on the presentation that you've done today, it sounds like you have other data, other audits that sort of break down those incidents in a more detailed way.
Are you talking about the use of force audit, 2020 use of force audit?
Yeah, that memo, and it had the graph with the stats for 2018, 2019, and 2020.
Mm-hmm. So to say that there's a more detailed audit that goes into that?
Yeah, because you said that you were trying to collect data that would break it down further, or that you've tried to break it down.
What I was referring to is that specific audit, because I think and I can flip through it here, but it's breaking down types of force that were used, it's breaking down gender, it's breaking down race that was associated with force that was used. That's what I was talking about, those categories breaking down into. We were referring to like interventions, that same information is what is utilized if we're looking at patterns of behavior. But that particular report there, that 2020 audit, is what I was talking about, the breakdowns in types of force used and against whom.
So that's the most specific breakdown that you have. The information that you send to the Department of Justice is broader, it's not broken down.
Correct. The Department of Justice information is very bare bones stats. How many times did you use force? What types of force did you use, whether it's bodily or it doesn't have a breakdown of the races that are associated with, but it does ask specifically if there was any injury associated to the person or the officers. It's much more bare bones to the Department of Justice is what they require.
Okay, so this would be
That's more comprehensive than what we send to DOJ.
This is the most comprehensive document.
Correct.
And with respect to racial incidents, this also would be the most specific document that you have?
Correct. Within that, we could, of course, drill down into every single individual incident if we wanted to through our Iapro software, but as far as a high-level report, yes, that's the most specific document generated.
Okay.
And I would just add that as you guys look through those documents, as the years have gone on, we continually change and I would suggest added and got more detailed about the information that IA reports when they look at those audits. So I guess I would suggest as a committee, maybe that's something that you guys look at and maybe make suggestions on additional information or additional breakdown. If there's something that you see in there or don't see in there that you would like to see, that would probably be helpful for me, knowing additional information that maybe the community is interested in seeing, especially as we look to do public-facing dashboards.
You went back to 2018. Do you have other records that go back further than that?
Aaron is on here, so Aaron could probably speak to that. I don't know if we still have those. Aaron?
Yes, we have 2017 through 2015 through 2017.
I don't know if other people want to go back that far. Yes? All right. And then, what was the other thing I wanted to follow? Statistics. So you don't think it's worth us getting the Department of Justice reports because they're more general?
Well, SB 2 is going to change that a little bit. It's going to add these, so under the 4th and 5th bullet points, so it requires all law enforcement agencies within the state to investigate and report all claims, allegations, and findings of serious misconduct regardless of the officer's employee status. Requires law enforcement agencies to report all complaints, claims, allegations, and findings of serious misconduct to the Commission of Peace Officer Standards and Training. And this took effect September 2021, so this report hasn't been created yet, but these new assembly bills are now requiring additional information than what was in that 2020 report.
I tried accessing the Department of Justice statistics and I just couldn't get through. I couldn't get any information.
Yeah, all this is new. It's all kind of got approved in September of 2021, so all these things are now being set in place. It's kind of like the RIPA stop data. We're not participating until January 2022. And some of those boards are not quite in place, but these are all things that are coming, and we'll be responsible for providing that additional information to DOJ.
Yeah, and what I've seen with DOJ is often they're, I mean, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, they're oftentimes a year behind. I mean, there's crime data, when we look often to crime data that's reported by Department of Justice to compare ourselves to other cities and things like that, it's often darn near close to a year, if not a year behind. So I'm not surprised, depending on how far you went back, to be able to find that.
The only other thing that we haven't been given is the lawsuits that have been brought or that are pending against the Modesto Police Department for use of force. You know, I know that we're not going to get into sort of the specifics of each lawsuit, but if, you know, I think we need to know how many have been brought, if they're settled, if they're pending. You know, the Modesto Bee did an article about a number of cases, but you can't tell from the article whether those were the sheriff's or whether it was the Modesto police was involved. There were like 17 or 18 cases, I think, that they cited.
That we need to follow up with our city attorney's office and see what legally is releasable. Obviously, I would imagine pending litigation and things like that probably aren't going to be disclosable, but I also don't want to speak for the city attorney's office.
Well, it's, you know, if it's filed, it's a matter of public record. It's just a matter of, I wanted to know whether it was the sheriff's department or the Modesto police that was involved in those. And then I just had a couple more questions. The use of force review, this Iapro software that you guys are using, which is, it sounds like it's much more specific, much more detailed. When did you start using that?
Well, Blue Team is the use of force review system that it's associated with Iapro. Iapro is kind of the overarching, but Blue Team, and I'm sorry if I get this date wrong, but 2012-ish, somewhere around there is when we started tracking uses of force pursuits through that particular system that automated it. Before is when the chief had alluded to it was all paper. But Iapro, way before then, I know I see cases, you can go back when you look at like damaged equipment and things like that, into the early 2000s, we started using that process, the Iapro process, which tracks internal affairs investigations, uses of force, all that type of stuff. But yeah, so it's been early 2000s that we've had Iapro, but added Blue Team approximately 2012.
And one more sort of, just one more. When you gave us the statistics on the number of applicants to the Modesto Police Department, it's really dropped significantly since 2015. You had like 2,200 applicants in 2015, and you only had like 576 in 2020. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's a trend that is being seen nationally. I think with, I think in my opinion, this is just my opinion, I think with a lot of the dynamics and change in law enforcement, I think obviously with a lot of, especially the last 2 years, a lot of scrutiny of law enforcement, we're seeing a lot of people just not interested in getting in the field. So we've seen, and it goes back, you know, like you said, to 2015. 2015, I think the statistic was 2,200, somewhere around there, applications, and 559 so far this year. And I think in talking to different chiefs and heads of law enforcement agencies around the state, even throughout the country, that's a trend that's been going on for years. But I think it's just something that I hope changes. I think there's a lot of opportunity in helping build law enforcement even better than it is now, and so we're trying to change that narrative, but I think for years you've seen a decline in interest in getting into the profession.
All right, so we're almost out of time. If anyone has a burning, urgent question, last question.
Well, I actually have two, but on the use of force that Aaron Tate provided on that report, there was the ending conclusion was, I'm recommending that policy 300 be updated to reflect best practices in capturing the officers involved shooting and Blue Team entries. Is that being implemented? Like, are we updating that policy?
Sorry, repeat that. His recommendation.
Aaron Tate recommended that the policy 300 be updated to reflect best practices in capturing the officer involved shooting and Blue Team entries. Can we? I was looking at policy 300, but I wasn't sure where he was trying to get that updated at.
Yeah, I believe we just had a recent update. I don't know if you have the most recent update, and Aaron, you can speak to that. I know that there was a change in who reports. Well, it wasn't officer-involved shootings, right, Aaron? It was use of force reporting. No, it was the officer-involved shootings being entered by the Violent Crimes Unit Sergeant, I believe, and some other changes you made, right? I believe that's, I think that's.
Yeah,
what
so
you're
what
referring
happened
to.
was, yeah, what I found was the use of force itself, because an officer-involved shooting is considered a use of force, was not being captured in blue team. Right, I found that through the audit. So my recommendation was, so that we do capture officer-involved shooting, since it is a use of force, it is being captured in blue team so we can track it.
Yeah, so just to even try to make that simpler, if that wasn't it wasn't easy to understand, was officer-involved shootings automatically go to IA or automatically involved or investigated that side of the house. So sometimes they weren't being, we were finding they weren't entered into just the regular use of force, but we also need it entered in the regular use of force database, so it's captured as a use of force when we look at our total numbers. So that was a recommendation and a policy change that was made in the policy to make sure that the homicide sergeant, the violent crime sergeant, is responsible for entering that into blue team.
Thank you. Last, real quick, is there any way that we'd be able to review the personal complaints that didn't get moved forward, that were just kind of tossed to the side, that you guys found nothing wrong with? Any of the...
Do you mean like unfounded complaints?
Yeah, unfounded complaints.
So those, as the chief was talking about before, all the legislation that comes in behind and all the laws associated with unfounded allegations in most cases are not something that are released to the public. It's simply to the complainant they get unfounded information. However, when you look at the Senate bill changes, you talk about releasing. From my understanding and reading it, we're all still digesting that language, but cases where someone accuses someone of excessive force, it's the accusation as opposed to being a sustained allegation that would be something that's released going forward.
And I would say the way we evaluate that is people make PRA requests. We work with the city attorney's office, look at the law, and decide whether things are releasable or not.
All right, and with that, we're out of time, so we'll cut off questions. But if you had a question you weren't able to get in, encourage you to type it up and email it to Kate so she can filter to the ad hoc group so it can be reviewed. And we can get into more depth then. If we could just go to the second to last slide, if you don't mind. So I'll see many of you tomorrow. We have the alternate response ad hoc meeting tomorrow at noon at City Hall, conference room 2001. And then the policies and procedures also tomorrow at 5:30, conference room 6825, also in City Hall. Please, if you're coming to those meetings, review your notes. Thank you so much. Especially with the policies and procedures ad hoc group that's on its second meeting, let's start to really think about what we need to do the work and come back early next year with some sort of framework for recommendations. So this is our schedule going forward. So January 20th, we'll be meeting again to have the second half of the accountability presentation, so another educational session. And then February and March are TBD, both in terms of exact date and also content to some degree. So, what's that? Oh, yes, I'm sorry, we'll do that one second. Please fill out the doodle poll that went out today so we can get those meetings scheduled. And like I said, it will really be the work done in the ad hoc groups that drives our February and March meetings. In addition to, we talked a little bit before about listening sessions, right, and what other voices we might need to bring into this conversation. So please be thinking about that as well. One more announcement, and then we'll do a final public comment. As we've talked about every time, so there's a opportunity to do ride-along and forced option simulator. I'm in the process of scheduling my ride-along, and here's the contact information for Ruth to reach out to get either of these scheduled. And so with that, I think we'll do one final public comment. Yeah. Oh, well, Tom? Tom, can you?
Oh, sorry, I'm not a member.
Yeah. But did you have something?
I'm not a member of the public, but
But did you want to say anything?
Oh, is there another comment? I just got a request to
Tom,
unmute myself, so I thought you were
had
talking
up.
to me.
Did you have anything you wanted to add? No.
I was going to clarify about the ad hoc meetings because I think I missed in the very beginning the audio was a little funky. Did you say that the ad hoc meetings needed to make some room on them? That there was some people that wanted to join that were unable to?
Yep, but as of this moment, we're good in that department so far. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to clarify. And then,
Yes.
Yeah.
No problem. Thanks, Tom. Oh, there is a public comment. Okay. Great. The other Tom.
Oh, yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Hey, Tom. Go ahead.
Yes, this is Tom Crane, again, the chapter chair of the ACLU of Northern California, Stanislaus County chapter. A question for the chief. Chief, if someone applies to your department and you determine to your satisfaction that they are a member of the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or some other organization identified by the FBI as domestic terrorists, what bearing does that have on your decision?
I think I look at the entire background, including any type of affiliations that any applicant has, and based on the determination if they fit our core values, if they fit the characteristics that we're looking for as a police officer, which extremist groups and anything identified by our federal government as a terrorist organization or anything of that nature would not be hired with Modesto Police Department.
Thank you, and with that, happy holidays, everyone. Hope everyone gets some rest and time with family, and we'll see some of you tomorrow and the rest of you January 20th. Take care.
Bye.